I will then pass on now to Gitika Bhardwaj, who is with Chatham House and will be moderating the next panel. Again, Gitika, I'd like to thank you very much for sticking with us right from the beginning. You're one of those loyal moderators. And I pass now the microphone to you to get your panel going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Atalantia, and good morning, everyone. My name is Gitika Bhardwaj, and I work as an editor at the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House, as Atalanti said. I'm also on the board of trustees of a think tank called Climate Outreach. But without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. Firstly, with us is Lauren Landis, Country Director in Kenya for the United Nations World Food Programme, who were awarded this year's Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to combat global hunger. She's had a distinguished career working in development, having previously worked for the US government, in addition to numerous international organizations and NGOs. Secondly, with us is Ines Burros, founder of Equal Profit and Burros Development, two social enterprises.
Yetika, 1 minute. Could you speak either a little bit louder? Because I think some people are having difficulty hearing you.
Yes, sure. Sorry.
Like closer to your microphone. Yeah.
Is that
Sorry.
better? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Secondly, with us is Ines Burros, founder of Equal Profit and Burros Development, two social enterprises working to improve the financial well-being of farmers. She's also a PhD candidate at HEC Luzon and previously worked in the food and beverage sector. And finally, with us is Caroline Wilkinson, nutritionist at the International Committee of the Red Cross, specializing in nutrition in crisis and post-crisis situations, also having previously worked at the UNHCR. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to begin, I just have a few words to kind of explain the landscape. So of course, global hunger is on the rise again, following decades of progress, with almost 690 million people, as Lawrence pointed out, in the world who are currently undernourished. And it could exceed 840 million by 2030 if we continue along the current trajectory. The UN has warned that without enough effort to reform the global food system, its target of zero hunger by 2030 will be missed, despite the human right to food being enshrined in numerous international instruments. Furthermore, of course, as Atlanti mentioned, the coronavirus crisis has revealed the fragility of food security for the most vulnerable communities around the world. The UN also warned earlier this year that multiple famines could even be seen in the coming months following the pandemic, which is making food security and addressing food security more urgent than ever. So from pandemics to climate change to conflict to economic instability, my first question to the panel is, in your work, what have you found to be the major drivers of global food insecurity and how is it leading to malnutrition? Lauren, if I could come to you first.
Sure. I think at the World Food Programme, most recently, having been humbled by having received the World Peace Prize related to this connection between food insecurity and conflict, I would have to answer your question to say that where we see conflict is where we see food insecurity and therefore where we see hunger. And so the number one thing that we're trying to do, working with governments, working with partners, is find the ways that we can calm the conflict and find the best entry, the most sustainable entryways into addressing malnutrition and food insecurity.
And Ines, if I could come to you next.
Sure. I completely agree with Lauren, and I think maybe we need to be conscious of what also the consequence of malnutrition is in terms of displaced migration. So if I just take the numbers of the FAO in 2015, we know that 244 million international migrants are moving around the world. There's, however, 740 million internal migrants, and this is just huge. And I think we need to be conscious of that, not only talking about malnutrition, but as well about their consequences. And an important percentage is that around 50% of those migrants are women. So what does it create in terms of vulnerability for those women, knowing as well that 1/3 of those women are youth. And youth, we name that 15 to 34 years old. So I think first, distress migration is a huge and important topic, and we need really to be aware of these problems. In terms of drivers of malnutrition, I would say in addition to conflict, it's important that we talk about poverty and rural poverty, which is, in my opinion, a key. Rural poverty drives food insecurity, but also it's also a consequence of limited employment, and as well a driver of limited employment. How do we create employment? And I take the words of Gain. How do we create agripreneurship that creates value for people in rural areas? That's maybe also a topic we can build on. A quote that I like to mention is the following: "If wealth was what was the inevitable result of hard work and enterprise, every woman in Africa would be a millionaire." So I would love to hear the two other panelists on this quote and what is their perception talking about conflict and about rural poverty.
Thank you, Ines. Perhaps, Lauren, do you have a comment on that quote?
Do I have a comment on that quote? Yeah? No, I love it. I think every woman in Africa should be a millionaire because I do see the hard work every day. But I'm hoping as we go through this panel, since it's a conversation, we should really jump in on that youth employment because the future hunger issues and economic viability of so many of these countries is going to be critical based on what we do with youth.
Definitely.
Thank you. And Caroline, of course, you have such a unique perspective working in crisis and post-crisis situations. I wonder, in your work, do you see the same picture when it comes to the drivers of food security?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I agree with the previous two with Lauren and Ines, in that where you see conflict, you often see food security, and then the other drivers of food insecurity that might be, climate change or recurrent droughts and floods, can then in turn lead to conflict because of fighting for resources. So it's a spiral, really, where yes, we definitely see food insecurity in conflict, and then the other drivers that are initially conflict related begin to be sources of conflict, and then as the food insecurity declines, the conflict often gets worse as people are competing for resources. But I mean, malnutrition, it really represents the single most threat for children worldwide. And whilst conflict and food insecurity is a major driver of this malnutrition and the huge numbers that Lauren was talking about, that Lawrence was talking about as well, it's not always just about food insecurity. Like Ines said, there are other drivers as well.
I would be sorry, I'm jumping.
Please.
It would be very interesting to understand from your point of view, Lauren and Caroline, how do you see the relationship between economic stability and conflicts, and how can we solve malnutrition via an increasing economic instability locally, and what is your action on the field in order to do that?
Lauren, do you want to talk about the work that WFP is doing on that?
Well, I mean, go ahead, Caroline. It's always better when someone else talks about your work for you.
Well, I mean, like many things that have been said this morning, investing in women, empowering in women, and having increased economic capital at the household level, whatever that may be. You know, it may be through increased access to jobs, to gainful employment, to agriculture related activities, livestock, etc., has an enormous impact on what's available at the household. What's available at the household at an individual level. That means that women can actually eat their fair share of the household dinner plate. It increases the diversity of the diet. I was reading the other day a new brief on livestock and nutrition, and the impact that just having a few extra animals at the household level can have on animal source foods, good quality protein, vitamins and minerals, that really have an impact on increasing the dietary diversity of young children and women and girls at the household level. And I think WFP are very much working along those lines on a large scale. In ICRC, we really try and work multi-sectorally, so bringing together the centres of agriculture, livelihoods, and you know, with a clear objective of making an impact on nutrition. You know,
and just to come back to the point that you all raised, which is the conflict being one of the drivers of food insecurity. You know, we've seen, for example, in places such as Yemen, which has threatened millions of people with starvation. But of course, one of the other drivers has been economic crisis, and we've seen that in Venezuela over the past couple of years, where this has fueled food shortages for hundreds of thousands of people. I guess my next question is, how have you seen in your work the causes of malnutrition in particular, but also wider issues to do with food insecurity, different in different contexts, for example, between rural and urban settings, developing and developed countries, and also crisis and post-crisis settings? If I could come to you first, Caroline.
I think the face of malnutrition is different depending on where you are. Very clearly, the types of malnutrition that we see in different areas are quite different. Just an example, I've been working for many years. I mean, I think I've been in various countries in Africa for 8 years, practically, you know, consistently working on treating children with malnutrition. And then I moved to Central Asia. I was working in Tajikistan, in the conflict in the south of Tajikistan. And I saw these children, and I thought, they really don't look like the other children that I've been treating, that I've been working with. And I think it's a geographical thing, but it's also to do with the nature of the situation. That in rural areas, and that's where I was mostly, people have access to a little bit of land, to other possibilities. Then when you get into an urban area, it really curbs people's ability to have a livelihood. If you're on the margins, if you're from Ines was talking about migration, you've migrated into a city, you're often living on the edge, on the margins, a little bit excluded from the whole sort of social tissue. You're not integrated into the markets, into the job markets. It can be extremely challenging for especially a woman alone in an urban area to actually survive. You know, her objectives of fending for her family are hampered by all of the additional risks that she might have in an urban situation compared to a rural situation, for example.
And Ines, if I could come to you next.
Sure. So I'm not an expert in conflicts, but rather I can talk a bit about livelihoods. And I had the same impression traveling to Ivory Coast for my work, and noticing that women were clearly malnourished, and that really raised the questions, and that drove to my research question for my PhD, which was how to make farming attractive to youth. So I very rapidly thought about how to increase their revenues and how to make sure that they can earn at least a living income. I'm not so a big fan of living income topic, and I think we should talk about prospering income, because who are we to talk about ensuring a living income to those people? So that's another question, and maybe another topic for later. But in terms of value creation, what is really interesting for me is how can we get for international supply chain out of the topic of market price. And in terms of local supply chain and looking at how food is produced and food is sold in the countries themselves and in local markets, I'm having a bit of an issue myself to understand the trade-off between how can we decrease the risks of production, minimize the risk of post-harvest losses, ensuring a fair price for those food products, and as well ensuring accessibility to the rest of the population who themselves don't earn a living income. So I would love to hear about my two other panelists to know how can we deal with this trade-off, and how can you do both?
Lauren, you might like to come in here.
There are so many things I would like to come in on, but I'll try and keep to a couple of points. First of all, I've just come from being WFP's head of nutrition in Rome down to a Kenya country director. It's not down, but it actually has expanded my global view in understanding malnutrition at the country level. And I just would jump in on Carolyn's points, particularly on urban populations, just for the moment. Two factors really have hit me, two statistics for Kenya. Over 80% of all jobs in Kenya are in the informal sector. And then the urban poor spend 50% of their daily income, and they're paid daily, on food. So you can see that when you add in something like a COVID-19, you're looking at a tremendously vulnerable population that can quickly move down into a downward spiral. And where kids may have already been stunted or malnourished, suddenly when as Lawrence outlined, when the crisis hits and healthy meals can't be put on the table, we see women really take the brunt of it, and their children as well in terms of their nutritional status. So it's really, what we're finding is even when you're not in a conflict environment, when you're in a tremendously vulnerable environment, it's so much the women that are holding that all together. And they're the ones that need to pull us, or need to pull the population away from that downward spiral. And if you'll just allow me, I was in, as Lawrence pointed out, in the informal settlements in Nairobi not too long ago. And these women that we provide resources to, they get $40 a month for their family. And I said to them, okay, come on, you've got so many burdens on your shoulders. What do you spend the money on? How do you spend it? And you wouldn't believe it, would break your heart. About 50% did go for food, but the rest went for insulin, for medications, for treatment, medical treatments for their children. And then finally, just to pay the rent. And it was very clear that so many of those burdens were falling on women, and they spent that money in just the hierarchy of need. You couldn't fault them a bit on how they were trying to save their families. So thank you. I'd love to go into the agricultural point at some other, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And I do want to delve more into the issue facing women. But just before we do, I did want to talk about climate change. And, you know, of course, we all know that how grave the challenges ahead of us because of climate change, and it's also known as a threat multiplier, and of course will exacerbate everything else. So just a question around food production. You know, we know that food production is, I think, projected to need to grow by a staggering 70% by 2035 in order to feed the growing human population. And the agricultural sector at the moment provides livelihoods for 40% of the human population. So I guess a question I did want to ask was, how do you balance providing food and nutrition and eliminating poverty, but also with managing the global climate and biodiversity crisis, for example, preserving the forests and things such as that? Perhaps I could come to you first, Lauren.
I would say on this one, I think our focus, we aren't a climate change agency in any way and wouldn't try to be. But I think our focus very much is to work with smallholder farmers to mitigate the effects of climate change. And so to see how we could plant certain crops, the timing of those crops, how the whole production, storage, everything is done with an eco-friendly, a climate change perspective in mind. I think that is the best thing that we can do in partnership with other organizations.
Thank you. And Ines and Caroline, please, do you have any thoughts on that too?
Sure. From my point of view, I think we need to prioritize. That means expecting that smallholder farmers will care about deforestation when they cannot afford a living is maybe a kind of a misconception. If we prioritize ensuring a living income, then I think we can talk about biodiversity and deforestation, which doesn't mean it's less important. But in my opinion, we need to also to put ourselves in their shoes. So that means ensuring maybe diversified employment opportunities, making sure that they earn for what they're selling. And I'm talking now about international supply chains. And that also leads to the topic of power dynamics. How do we make sure that we create a share value along supply chains and don't make people earn less than their cost of production? This is another topic that is also important. So it's very, very complex. But in my opinion, first, let's make sure that they earn something to live. And then we can also take care about deforestation, because what would be their incentive to destruct their own biodiversity and their own resources, you know? Like, this is really, I think really we need to understand their perspective from that point of view. So, but that doesn't mean we cannot do anything right now. And diversifying, for example, and having some agricultural practices, which is rather going towards agrobiodynamie or diversified products, making sure that they're taking care of their soil. There are plenty of different measures we can also implement together with different partners, looking at agricultural systems. But yes, in my opinion, we are putting a lot of pressure in terms of climate change, whereas in my opinion, poverty is really number one priority. But maybe it's a bit bold, and I'm not sure everybody agrees with me, and that's fine. But I would love to hear what your two other organizations are thinking about this topic.
And Caroline, please. Yeah.
I think, you know, I think needs are essential, like Lauren was saying, you know. Choices people make are really dependent on their initial resources. And then, as you were saying, you know, if people don't have the resources, they will do what they can to feed their family. They will do what they can as their objective in the morning to make my family survive. And whether that means cutting down the trees around an IDP camp or around a refugee camp, because they have to feed their family, they have to cook the food that they have, that will be done. So I agree that if on a fairly small scale, I mean, we're not talking about big agribusinesses here, we're talking about the impact of people in conflict situations. We have to ensure that they have what they need to fulfill their basic, very, very basic needs to be able to make a change, a shift in people caring about the biodiversity. Because until those basic needs are fulfilled, their their sole objective is survival, and so we have to work on that. So I would very much agree with Ines and Lauren in that respect.
Thank you. And to now come to, women in more detail. We know, of course, that women face, I think it's a 27% higher risk than men are facing severe food insecurity. It'd be great to discuss in more detail, why are women disproportionately affected, and what are the systemic issues which make it difficult for women to exercise their right to food and nutrition for themselves and their families, perhaps in comparison to men. Ines, if I could come to you first.
This is not my expertise. I think it would be better that Lauren takes over, or Caroline. Sorry.
That's fine. Perhaps Lauren would like to come in first.
Well, I think Lawrence outlined many of the reasons that we see, whether it's access to markets, whether it's access to education, and all the constraints that he outlined in terms of just having the ability, the right paperwork to take on land tenure or whatever it is, the core components to make you food secure. If you're trying to do it as a woman-headed household all by yourself, and you don't have those key components in your hand, whether it be a plot of land or the right form of education, you're going to be constrained every single time. And so I think what we see in a lot of the programming that governments try and do, and agencies who support them, like the World Food Program, is to try and look at it through the woman's eye. Where are those constraints? Where are those bottlenecks? And how can we support marginal and vulnerable populations to decrease those bottlenecks? And I think that is really a lot of the focus of where we decide how and when and where to do our programming in food insecurity in a place like Kenya, but also in many places around the world.
Perhaps Caroline, do you have any thoughts to add to that too?
I think, what I would add to that is the physiological vulnerabilities as well. We haven't spoken a lot about just the basic physiology of women and adolescent girls that does make them more vulnerable nutritionally. I don't have the exact figures to hand, but anemia is very, very high in women globally, but especially exacerbated in conflict and other emergency situations as the quality of the food goes down, basically. And this really hampers women's possibility really to engage in an active lifestyle. I don't know how many of you have suffered from anemia in your time. I'm sure quite a few of you. It's a very common problem, but it really does make you feel very, very tired. And engaging in your daily to-do list. For me, it's speaking this morning at the conference, making my lunch, and then working on some field support for my ICRC colleagues. But as a woman in a conflict-affected area, I have to be up early, get the fire going, find the water, the firewood, repair the house, take care of the kids, go to the malnutrition center, perhaps do a bit of gardening to feed the family. So when you have anemia and some of the other nutritional deficiencies that women have, it just makes life an awful lot harder. And just to give you an idea, in last year in 2019, the ICRC did rapid nutrition surveys in northeast Nigeria and in South Sudan, and over 50% of the women that were surveyed were malnourished. So they'd had significant weight loss. We didn't test their anemia at the time, but the probability was that there were a lot of them that were anemic. And I think that really really affects as well women's possibility to overcome the food security problems.
Maybe just to add on that, I think also something that is important that I'm seeing with the development of an app I'm creating to ensure that farmers take the control of their finances is the financial knowledge that women have in comparison to men. And that also is linked to the access to technology. So we are seeing here, for example, if we want that a woman in a household has access to this app, which helps her understand what is the revenues, what is the cost, and as well to project into the future, to make projections and to ensure that when she will retire, she will earn something that is decent, is also complex, because how do you deal with a woman in a household having access to her own smartphone, whereas also the men might be willing in some cases to have a control over that. So financial knowledge, in my opinion, is key and is directly linked to malnutrition. So that was just a parenthesis.
And of course, you've all touched upon it. Rural women are often most at risk, denied the most basic rights, whether it's to have an education, own property, and a decent income. And yet, amazingly, 70% of rural farmers are women and feed 75% of the world's population. So that's fantastic. But of course, we're also seeing increasing rural households being headed by women, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. Perhaps Ines, you could talk us through, because I know you look a lot at farmers, why the role of women is so important in the sector, and also why are women so important for the global food system as well?
Sure, but first, in terms of percentages, we know that around 60 to 80% of smallholder farmers are women. So this is a huge part of the agricultural labor force. Second, because I think they don't have the financial knowledge to get back to my point, in order to negotiate as well. And here we also talking about power dynamics. How can we make sure that that farmers, and in particular women, have the power, the negotiation power to make sure that they earn as well a living income? Again, coming back to the same topic, for the global supply chains, I think this is super important, because if they cannot negotiate and they don't have this bargaining power that we would like them to have, then again, they can be under, for example, let's take coffee or cocoa. When you see the market price for those two commodities, often, and because of the volatility of the prices, they are below cost of production, which in my opinion is completely unacceptable. So how do we change the food system to ensure that at least people earn a decent profit, and that this profit is shared equitably along supply chain actors? And this is not only smallholder women, this is women also along the supply chains, until shareholders, until consumers. Yeah, how do we break power dynamics? How do we make sure that also actors who are close to consumers don't use their own status and their own place in the supply chain to impose huge margins? And how do we make sure that this value is created fairly along the supply chain? And I think women have a huge stake to change this food dynamics. Yeah.
Thank you. And Lauren, if I could come to you next.
Yeah, I think one of the big changes that you see is that people are really looking at a food systems approach and working with governments to look at the different food systems and where are the gaps and the problems within national food systems. And I think that a lot of the small work that we're doing with smallholder farmers is trying to do that. From, are we producing the food that is actually nutritious? And how is that food processed so that it will have the greatest nutritional impact? so that we can have a dual effect. In other words, even the classic example for WFP is that if we have the small community producing the food to feed to the children at noon in school, something we call homegrown school feeding, we can then both work on the menus to make sure they're healthy. We can make sure that the crops are produced locally and then purchase from the farmers to feed to children to make sure they get a healthy diet. That's only a small piece of the overall food system, but you can see how an impact on that can have a huge impact on both child and women health.
Caroline, would you add anything to that?
I just add a tiny bit, and again, it's about choices and possibilities, but the type of crops that are being, or the types of vegetables that are being grown makes a huge difference in, or can make a huge difference in, the dietary diversity, which can then in turn really improve the nutritional status of both children and women. But it's not always possible. Just circling back to the conversation we were having earlier, if many of these crops are being sold, or the produce are being sold rather than consumed, then the effect that you're looking for doesn't actually help. So if we come back to the basic needs again, that people are able to eat the diverse crops that they're growing, maybe to sell a bit, but to have a real impact, they do need to either eat them, consume them, or be able to buy something a higher quality to compensate.
And this is
it's really important.
This is also where we see the competition between international markets and local markets. And how do we make sure that the food that is nutritious and valuable, that is produced locally, is not sold abroad, but is also consumed locally? And that's also a question of prices. And yeah, I don't know if you're working with governments on those topics, or how do you? Yeah, I would love to hear about Lauren. How does the World Food Program works with the topic of prices?
Can I jump in there, or do you have another question in mind? Yeah, no, I think that what you would find, in some ways in a particular country, you might think that WFP is a big player in a food system. We're actually probably a very small one, but in countries where we're doing, in a conflict country or where there's an emergency, where we still do a more traditional food aid, we are really doing much of the procurement either locally or regionally. And so the local or regional procurement, of course, with a study to make sure it's not going to have a negative impact on the local economy, is the focus. And only internationally procured food aid is when it isn't available or economically viable in that country or the region. And yes, it sometimes is cheaper to buy on the international market than local, but there are so many other positive fall-on impact if you can buy locally, that's of course our objective. But we work with donor money, so sometimes the international price is so much lower, and we can buy so much more needed food with that international lower price, that becomes our priority, because we have so many mouths to feed in a particular situation like a Yemen or something like that. So we have a set of ways that we think about our procurement, and we are continually working to see how we can do more of the things, help with fortification locally, so that then that brings in millers and more parts of the supply chain to be involved in creating that nutritious diet, creating markets for vegetables in refugee camps, so that you create a viable, help traders to create a local market for vegetables, for example. So we're very clear when we go local and why we would go international.
Of course, producing locally has a bearing on the climate as well, on the challenges faced in terms of climate change. Coming back to the coronavirus crisis this year, of course, it's just so topical. We've seen how the pandemic has uncovered the challenges faced by women disproportionately, while exacerbating the existing inequalities that women face too. Given that the World Health Organization has declared 4 global health emergencies over the past decade and outbreaks are becoming more common, how should decision makers ensure that women are supported when designing solutions? And how far should a gendered approach play in local, national, and domestic efforts to addressing the challenges ahead? Lauren, if I could start with you.
Sure, that's a very complex question for a quick answer. Very thoughtful. I like it a lot. I'd like to come back at it someday. But I think what we're seeing is governments are getting more sophisticated at how they design their social protection systems and making sure that women are a key focus of those systems. And I think that's absolutely critical, that we need to make sure that women's needs and that women are targeted by such systems, because you see, if they're not, when a COVID-19 hits, things can go south much quicker, and women can help pull it together if they're also a target of the assistance. I guess that's my personal opinion. I don't have any stats to go with it today. Thank you.
And if I could bring you in as well.
I don't have much more to add. I would agree with Lauren. I think women are very often underestimated in what they are able to do with very, very little. Prioritizing and empowering women in making their own choices. They're very capable of making their own choices that are very often the right choices for them and their family. So I think maybe a little bit more engagement with women, asking them what they would want to do, what they need to do, what they need to do. A little of that would go a long way in actually helping them to help themselves.
And Ines, is there anything you would like to add to that too?
No, I fully agree with both.
Great. And so, thinking ahead to the solutions, in your respective work, what solutions would you advocate for girls and women? Is it education, training, finance, or ensuring and protecting rights to land and property? Or is it including more women in the decision-making processes? What would be the solutions that you would want people to prioritize at all levels? Ines, perhaps I could start with you.
Sure, with pleasure. So from my PhD results, I've created 2 companies, and one is called Equal Profit. So I wanted to have something that goes beyond fair trade, beyond all the certification schemes that are existing in the market today. And the objective of this certification is to break power dynamics along supply chains and make sure that we take cost of production as a key element in determining prices, be it on the local market or international market. And in my opinion, that's one solution. It's not the only one for sure, but at least this ensures that there is something that is not subjective, that we don't calculate the prices subjectively, which is often the case when we talk about fairness, but we calculated costs and we aggregate costs along the supply chain for each supply chain actor. We take the differences between the selling price and the total cost, and this is the total profit. And the objective is to share this total profit proportionally to the cost. So that means that a farmer who has 10% of the total cost will earn 10% of the total profit. And in my opinion, that's a way of really breaking power dynamics and making sure that this is transparent along the supply chain. And farmers have a word to say about the costs of the end actors. So I'm talking about retailers or transformers, and vice versa. So this is really, I would aim to move towards something where solidarity is key, and where we don't push and squeeze each other along supply chains, but where we help each other and build on each other. But this is not only the case for prices. I think it should be also the case for risks. How do we ensure that farmers don't take all the risks? And this is also a key aspect of malnutrition. How do we make sure that they are not the only ones suffering from climate change and from post-harvest losses and from prices risks? And this is so in my opinion, we also need to make sure that everybody share these risks along the supply chain. That's why we are also having a tool which is a risk mapping along the supply chain for each actor, so that everybody can act on each other. A second company that I have created, because I'm aware that breaking power dynamics and sharing money and power is not in the profit of everybody, or everybody doesn't want to go towards that, not because they're not willing, but because there are institutional pressure pushing for not changing the food system, because you have shareholders which are willing to have return on investment on a quarterly basis, because you have consumers who want the sustainability story but don't want to pay more for the same product. So there are so many pressures along the supply chains, or even within our economic system, that doesn't allow big companies which have been born within these institutional settings to change. So that's why I have created this second company, which is this app. And I'm hoping via this online application that smallholders can take the control of their own financial future. And with this data, they can move forward and ensuring that they don't depend on their own children in order to ensure a decent retirement, for example.
Thank you. And Caroline, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, I think my thoughts are on a very different level, perhaps a more sort of field level than Ines. But I mean, I think there are two things in conflict situations. There's the rights. I mean, the rights of populations. The rights of populations, but especially women, and the right to food. I think upholding these rights is very it's fundamental, really, and I think that's one of the forces of organisations like the ICRC when you're looking at upholding the Geneva Conventions, the international humanitarian law, and protecting civilians in these situations, including their right to food and other things. So I think that's one thing that's overarching, but is extremely important to be able to facilitate things. And then secondly, I think is really support to women. Women's access just very fundamentally to healthcare, to social services, and to other sort of support services that are tailored to women, that are people-centered and are adapted. I can come back to what Lawrence was saying about adapted to women's timing. Maybe the middle of the afternoon when she has to bring her child to the nutrition center, it's really not the best time for her, because she'd rather be in the fields, tending to the fields for the families. So I think it increasing the access and availability of healthcare, and both curative and preventative for women, that's tailored really to their needs and provides support rather than just care, is really, really important. And when I say that, mental health and and women's role is inextricably linked. I mean, you can't dissociate women's mental health from their capacity to function. And as people are so reliant on women across the world, and I think we could speak for hours on the need and the linkages between mental health and all of the women's challenges, but then nutritional challenges as well. So support in general that's really tailored to women's needs.
And Lauren.
Maybe those are very nice answers. So maybe I could just add in a small piece. I wouldn't forget education. It's so basic, but so important. We know from study after study that a woman who's more educated has fewer children and more food secure and less malnourished children. And also nutrition education for that mother can have, you know, how long she breastfeeds, those kinds of things can have a fundamental impact, particularly on children in their early years. And so I wouldn't forget the education as being really key.
Thank you. And as a sort of last question, if you could each summarize, you know, what would be the next steps in your opinion? What would it take to bring food rights to all, and particularly to women? And what is the role of women in achieving this? You know, who needs to take action, and when, and where, and what can we do to achieve this lasting change once and for all? If I could perhaps start with you, Lauren.
You know, I really think that women are stepping up, and I think it's our job to really help them, empower them, and make sure that their voices are heard, but also encourage them to make sure that their rights are heard. We don't realize just how much women that work on these issues are role models, and how much we can help create role models, particularly in the field and the work we do, and encourage them to make sure their voices are heard. I guess that's what I'd say today.
That's fantastic. And Ines, if I could come to you too.
Okay. Yeah. So something very concrete. I'm part of an organization which is called the Agripreneurship Alliance. And I had the pleasure, so the Agripreneurship Alliance is organizing a prize where they collect some business plans, hundreds of business plans, and they provide a prize for a money prize for helping young people develop their business ideas. And I had the pleasure to review 4 business plans, and 2 of them were made by women. And I thought, this is just amazing, the ideas and the passion, the willing of having a fair value, having more women empowered within the business itself. And I think helping young women build their own companies, and helping them also to invest in those in these companies on the later stage, not only having 10,000 or 100,000, I don't know, to have something on the long term, having some networks helping those young entrepreneurs. I think that's key, because the business world, as Lawrence has also mentioned previously, is mainly run by men, and having a big impact on that. I think it goes via helping women.
Thank you. And Caroline, it'd be great to hear from you too.
I think the current situation with the coronavirus and the pandemic will actually help to further the gender agenda, if you like, because I think it will become obvious how women, Lauren, like you said, are stepping up, and how they are drivers for change in their own right. And I think it just goes back to what I was saying before, that I think we need to engage women more. We need to ask them what they need to help themselves. And I think I do actually think that there could be positive in this negativeness of the pandemic, in that women will show that they're entirely capable, and that the choices they make positive results. And to harness that energy, the knowledge, and the drive that women have all around the world, whether it be in conflict, non-conflict, urban, rural situations. So I think it has to come from the women themselves, but to do that, we all have to be ready and willing to listen and to take their ideas on board. I think it's
great
fantastic.
place to end. Thank you. Thank you so much, ladies. That was such a fascinating conversation. I'd like to now open up the floor for questions, if anyone.
There we are. Am I on mute? Yes. So there are some questions in the chat box, which I think we will bring to you. But I just want to make one comment. We're going back to the I think Lauren and Caroline put forward that it's a priority, you know, when we talked about climate change and the priority of feeding your families, and that not being something that will be a priority at the time. And we had two panels prior to that. We had a panel on on Tuesday, and then a short film yesterday, in which what was very, very powerful about the discussion was the richness of traditional methods of farming, which were being shared cross-generationally. And the two women were talking about sub-Saharan Africa, about understanding how to maintain the soil, and joining the younger ones, coming in with more innovative approaches, and the cross-generational power was very, very strong. And then yesterday we saw a short film, which I think was also very interesting, because I think one of the things is talking about incentives. How can we incentivize? How can we give women their power through really recognizing what they're doing for the land? And it was showing a Brazilian farmer who was running a fruit farm with her family, and an argument was made that she was also protecting the soil in the rainforest, and that she should be actually remunerated for the protection and of the rainforest, and she should be given cash for the carbon that she was protecting. So I think what's interesting is, more and more we need to go outside of our silos and see, okay, we can work with these very rural women, because sometimes the transmission of knowledge and the protection of the environment and the ability to create a greater biodiversity by the traditional methods of growing could really be something that could go into climate change. So that's not a question, it's just recapping what we've heard, and I think just adding to the conversation. I'm now going to pass to Barbara, who is going to now help you with the questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Atalanta. Yes, I have two. I've just kind of done a quick look through, and folks could try and add a couple more if they want to. There are two for Ines that are kind of related to the same around pricing. I think people were interested to understand when you mentioned, it sounded like you had in your PhD, perhaps this was something from your PhD that you worked on. So maybe without going into too many technical details, just to understand, one was, how do you bring people not to calculate price subjectively and think more with solidarity? What are the actions you've already implemented and worked out? And I'll go ahead and read the second one because it's very related. How do producers decide what their costs are? For example, are their own labor costs factored into this? And how do individuals decide what their labor costs should be and not undercut or undervalue themselves? Well, I'll just stop at that. Those two similar questions for Ines.
Our model, so the name of this certification is called Equal Profit. And what we have done until now, we have one pilot project in coffee and one in cocoa. And we have built a questionnaire which states all the type of costs that farmers can have for both coffee and cocoa production. Something that is new in comparison to existing certification scheme is that we integrate a living income within the costs of smallholder farmers, for smallholder farmers themselves, but as well for their own workers if they have some. So this is new, because normally what we expect from farmers is that they earn a living from the profit they make. which is completely different. And in terms of costs, now because we are a bit constrained in terms of resources, we cannot audit the costs and know where they are correct or not. Because you would imagine that the incentive for farmers now is to boost their costs in order to earn more profit according to the model I've just explained before. So in order to mitigate that risk, for now, we trust a bit our counterparts, and we start with what we have. So for smallholder farmers and cooperatives, for example, we really have some communication with them orally to understand what is the structure of the cost, and they tell us what they are. For bigger actors, we take their accounting documents in order to verify where the costs are right or not. In the future, what we are planning to do in order to mitigate that risk and to ensure that we are a credible certification as well, is that we are developing a platform with EPFL, which has an algorithm in machine learning, which help us define where the costs that have been reported are within a norm. And if they are not, so the algorithm will show us that this is out of the norm, and we will ask the actor in particular to provide some proof. And it's fine, you can have higher production costs, you just need to justify them. In the future, this algorithm will learn, and that's the objective. And the more supply chain we will have within this platform, and the more actors, the thinner the machine learning will learn and will tell us exactly, is that right or is that wrong? So this is a first way of having correct data. And in addition to that, in the future, we'll partner as well with an international auditor, which will help us having a random sampling of a few supply chains so that we can check it as well, but on a random sampling, which means that it will decrease the costs of certification drastically, because now what is happening is that we are sending there are some auditors on the field, which cost a lot for farmers and for cooperatives. And we want to dilute this cost of certification along the supply chain so that everybody pays for the certification, which I think is fair.
Thank you very much, Ines, for that very thorough answer. And I'm sure there's a lot more details behind all of that, and people could go directly to you if they have more questions about that, about the work that you're doing. One more set of questions for Lauren, since there is time. One early on was, how could WFP have more ability to look at local solutions that are tried and tested, scientifically backed, but not able to list due to WFP criteria? And the second one was just to ask if you could speak a bit about where the super cereal +++ is produced in Africa.
Okay, two of my favorite issues. First of all, I hope to tell you if I come on next year that Super Cereal ++ is not only produced in Rwanda, but also in Kenya, because I believe that the local production of these specialized nutritious products is absolutely critical. And I feel that countries like Kenya should be able to take that on. And so coming out of nutrition, that's in my back pocket, is something we need to figure out. In terms of the supply chains, I think, as I expressed earlier, we're going more and more local in terms of WFP. WFP is not your WFP of 20 years ago, where we just buy everything internationally and pump it into countries. It's much more bought and purchased regionally and locally. The one exception is when we're trying to treat and prevent acute malnutrition. And in those cases, we use the WHO standards for what a product should include. That doesn't mean it can't be produced locally, but there is a particular set of formula which does get reviewed and probably is looking at an update in the coming years. But that's what we would abide by. And so I think in improving local diets, we would be very excited about local solutions, things that grandmas used to make to prevent malnutrition in their kids, and thinking about how that can be reintroduced and adopted into the local diets. And I think those solutions are very prevalent, and we just need to work really hard with both grandmothers and women to encourage their readoption if they are scientifically proven to work.
Those are the last. Should I hand it back over to Gatik?
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are the last questions, so I can hand it back over to our moderator.
Leslie? Yeah. So we have 5 minutes left. Gitika, I hand it back to you, maybe to, if there are any more questions you would like to address. I think we've got 5 minutes, and I think we've got a great panel here, so let's not lose the opportunity.
I guess a question I would say is looking more ahead to the future, we kind of touched upon it at the end. How do you see the food landscape change? Do you see there being hope, us achieving zero hunger by 2030? Of course, that seems far-fetched now, but do you think it is possible to achieve, or at least come close to it, if all the measures that you have identified were to be taken? And that's open to the panel.
I could jump in there maybe with a caution rather than a hope. Unfortunately, maybe not a positive reflection. If you think back to Lawrence's first slides, there's that big circle of 1.7 billion that are also overweight and obese in the world today. And I feel that we also have to watch out for the future, that we don't suddenly go from stunted to overweight, and that we really need to focus on the quality of the diets. It's got to be about getting the right nutrients in to these kids and in to the mothers of tomorrow. Just to leave you with a saying, I mean, the adolescent girl in a family has the highest nutrient needs. But as we pointed out today, she probably eats least and eats last. And so those are some of the things we need to focus on in the future.
Thank you. And Caroline and Ines, would you add anything to that as well? Are you more hopeful, or do you think there still needs to be a significant amount of caution?
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go. It's not entirely negative, and there are many inroads that have been made. But then there are factors that make us step back. So the pandemic is one of them. But I think there is a lot of hope for the future, but there's still an awful lot of work to be done, and I think we need to engage communities, to engage women, and to help empower them to be able to further and to accelerate the gains that we've been making, and to recover the losses that we've faced over the pandemic.
I fully agree. I think there's a lot of hope as well. There's the new generation, which comes with so many new ideas, so much knowledge as well. And I'm really impressed by all those young people willing to change the system. We need to change the system. That's not a question at all. We need to change our economic system. I think that's key as well, in order to have impact on the field and impact locally. If we don't change how we are creating money, how we are creating value, how women are treated as well, it's going to be tough. But I'm sure the new generation is really moving in the right direction. So I'm full of hope, and I hope it's going to work out.
Thank you. Perhaps I can pass it back to Giving Women team.
Hi, so I'm Eliana. I'm the founder's daughter, for those who don't know me, and also an executive committee member for Giving Women. Thank you all so much for that really, really insightful conversation. It was a true pleasure to hear you guys share your wisdom with us. And what I particularly appreciated in the conversation was how you were able to to capture really from the individual, the women on the ground, the families, to the macro, the systems around them that are influencing, and really valuing so much the cultural norms that are there, but also understanding that this works within an entire system, which is really what we're trying to capture today, and understand how this can all fit together with some of the solutions that you guys are bringing forward. So thank you so much for this absolutely insightful first panel for today. We're so grateful for your participation.